Okay, we're beginning chapter 7. There's a lot of stuff in chapter 7, but it all has to do with property, plant, and equipment, which includes natural resources and intangible assets. So let's just go ahead and get started. We're going to talk first about, not really do a problem, but just talk about something quite important with respect to costs for long-term assets. First of all, there are lots of costs you may not normally think of as an asset, but they do end up in the cost of the asset. So I mentioned here taxes and commissions are some obvious ones, like a real estate commission or a tax when you buy a property. Sometimes you have to pay a tax to the state, a stamp tax. And then they end up in the cost of a building, let's say, and then that building gets depreciated. Also, the other thing is that land is not a depreciable asset. And as such, when you buy property with land, you usually have to separate out the part of the cost associated with the land versus the part of the cost associated with the building. That becomes very important because the land is never expensed. Another major thing you're learning in accounting, and this is true regardless of whether you are an accounting major, is that the word cost does not mean expense. In our everyday life, you may say, hey, I went to that show, what did it cost you? Or I got my car fixed, what did it cost you? But in accounting, a cost is a using up of resources. However, sometimes that using up of resources is transformed into a long-term asset. And that when a cost is transformed into a long-term asset, it's called a capital expenditure. So capital equipment is equipment that's a long-term asset. So any expenditure that increases the life of a long-term asset or increases its operating ability, that would be a capital expenditure. Here are some real simple examples. If you replace an air filter or your annual furnace cleaning, a corporation's furnace cleaning, that's maintenance. If they replace it, they would capitalize that furnace and depreciate it over its useful life. Also, if you think of like buildings on campuses, on our campus, 30 years ago, they weren't wired for internet. Well, they had to expend a lot of resources to wire the buildings, so that would extend their useful life. There's a lot of judgment between what's a capital expenditure, what's an expense. So that comes into play, but regardless, in some cases it's very clear what's a capital expenditure and what's, or in most cases, what's an expense. But the main thing is, well, one main thing you're going to take from this semester is don't use the word cost to mean expense. All right, in the next section, what we're going to do is talk about depreciation methods, or once we have a long-term asset, how do we transfer that asset into an expense? What are the rules for recognizing that expense?